Good morning, our viewers. Welcome to yet another event on the Council for Strategic Affairs platform. My name is Dr. Adityanjee, and I'm the president of the Council for Strategic Affairs. Those of you who registered using our Eventbrite link probably saw this flyer. Today is Saturday, October 26, 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime, and 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, where our distinguished speaker is based. The topic of today's distinguished lecture is Communist China's View of the World. And our distinguished speaker is Dr. Sriparna Pathak. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council imparts education in the field of international relations. Council fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. We encourage strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. CSA encourages publication of articles on geopolitics. We condemn terrorism in all its forms worldwide. CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. CSA is registered as a 501c3 organization with the IRS in the US. And those of our viewers who are based in US, we request them to donate and support to CSA by going on this particular link. We do a monthly roundtable discussion on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. EDT. We have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on the fourth Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. EDT, just like we are having today. We also have a one-on-one interview feature called Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee. The Council organizes symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote articles. We have a summer internship program for college students, as well as a fellowship training program in strategic studies. Very pleased to say that currently we do have a training fellow, Kushi Mishra, based in Kolkata, India. Again, it's registered as a 501c3 organization, so please don't hesitate to donate and support. And you will see that's a picture of our distinguished speaker. Dr. Sriparna Pathak is an associate professor and the founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at O.P. Jindal Global University in Haryana in India. She serves also in the capacity as associate director at the Jindal India Institute. She teaches courses on foreign policy of China as well as theories of international relations. In year 2022, she published a book titled Drifts and Dynamics, Russia's Ukraine War and Northeast Asia. Her previous work experience covers universities like Guwahati University, Don Bosco University. She has worked in the Ministry of External Affairs as a consultant for the Policy Planning and Research Division, working on China's domestic and foreign policy. Dr. Pathak has also worked for think tanks like Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi and Kolkata, respectively, South Asia Democratic Forum in Brussels, where she is a research fellow, and at the Center for Armed Forces Historical Research in New Delhi, where she worked as a researcher. She is also associated with Taiwan's Doublethink Lab as a regional partner and works on tracking China's influence operations. Dr. Pathak was awarded her doctorate degree from the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2015. She is a polyglot. She is fluent in English, Hindi, Mandarin, Bengali, and Assamese. She has been a resource person for various media organizations, colleges, universities, and think tanks within India and abroad, and she can be reached at her email and on Twitter. Before I hand over the platform to Dr. Sriparna Pathak, a little bit about China. So for our viewers, this is the map of China in yellow in 1911. The all in yellow is China. And this is also the map of China, I think somewhere in 1940s. Again, look at China's boundaries, how they have fluctuated over a period of time. And this was a tongue-in-cheek map of China, which was posted on Twitter by General Naravane. So that tells you Chinese occupied Tibet, Chinese occupied East Turkestan, Chinese occupied South Mongolia, and Manchuria. This is the current political map of China. So China's boundaries have expanded, which tells you the imperialist and expansionist mindset. Again, it lists 8 or 9 countries against which China has a border claim. The map of India in this particular map is not correct. Few of our housekeeping rules. I would request all our audience to keep their self muted. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. Please do not interrupt our esteemed speaker. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. All the questions are moderated through chat function. Please be precise and specific in asking a question. Please don't find detailed comments in the form of a lecture or a monologue. Lastly, we are recording this event. It will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. It's being simultaneously live streamed also. So without further ado, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to invite Dr. Sriparna Pathak, Associate Professor at Global Jindal University. Dr. Pathak, the platform is yours. Please go ahead. Welcome.
Thank you so much, sir, for that kind and warm introduction. It's always a pleasure to be here and to listen to the excellent work that you've been doing. Um, you know, how does China really see the world is a very pertinent topic because there's an urgent need to understand how China sees the world now. What is the world that China seeks to create by 2049 when the People's Republic of China turns 100 years old? As China becomes more powerful, more influential in international relations, Beijing will fundamentally change the international system which was created by the US and the liberal institutional order. The key question for international politics today is what kind of world does China seek to create by 2049, which is the centenary of the PRC? Is China going to sustain the present liberal system? Is it going to forge another one anchored on its own ambitions, its cultures, its desires? Now, the millennia of Chinese history strongly suggests the latter, that it's going to forge another entire system anchored on its own ambitions and cultures and desires. In this, the economic order is of particular importance because it's going to be a very weird mix of hypercapitalism and neo mercantilism. The political order, however, is going to be authoritarian. And understanding China's ambitions and grand strategic objectives, therefore, is very important. China's grand strategic vision is of primacy, which is basically that China will and should be the dominant force in international politics. Xi Jinping has been constantly using the phrases one world, one dream, which is a modern form of what China calls Tianxia, or all under the heaven concept. This concept actually serves as the foundation of China's imperial ideology, the Chinese conception of how the world should be ordered. And the ways in which China or the Chinese see the world is very hierarchical. It's not a horizontal division of powers in the ways that multilateral system is organized. It's a very vertical sort of order in which China is right at the top. Now, this concept of Tianxia, or all under heaven, is the genesis of the Chinese worldview with respect to how China ought to be ruled, its primary position in international politics, and the subordinate roles which are needed of other states. So, first and foremost, it needs an ethnic Han polity, which is inherently authoritarian. You showed that map, in the very beginning, as to how China has basically occupied all other places, be it East Turkestan or Tibet. All of these places, historically didn't have an ethnic Han polity. So China would want an ethnic Han polity, which is why there would be more and more occupations. Second, it requires that a single powerful monarch, which is the Chinese emperor or the son of heaven, should rule the entire civilized world, which by definition would be unified under the emperor's control so that disorder and chaos may be avoided. Very often it is, pondered over, what is China scared of? China is scared of disorder because its inherent worldview is very hierarchical, in which order plays a very important role. Multilateralism talks about a lack of hierarchy. China would not want that. It would want that hierarchical status because that's what traditionally, historically, culturally has been its guiding ideology. Now, the fundamental ideas and values which have forged China's political culture remain till today. What China wants in 2049 dovetails with what China wants today or actually wanted in its imperial past. There's a profound continuity in the Chinese worldview, its imperial ideology, including why its political leaders believe in domination, and domination provides the best outcome for its citizens, for its denizens, for all states in the international system. This is because for a large part of its history, China was the epitome of power. It held a dominant position in East Asia. Its relationships with neighboring countries were based on a very hierarchical tribute system, which provided China with humongous amounts of power, influence, as well as prestige. So, which is why a resurgent China today will be one with emboldened leadership desires to recapture a modern form of this position. Xi Jinping has been constantly talking about the China dream, or a retreat or a revival of the past. In this, again, economic goals are very important because China is actively trying to replace the liberal principles of the Washington Consensus with its own development model. And that's going to be a very weird, strange mix of hypercapitalism with neo-mercantilist policies, the China model, which offers subsidized development to developing countries with no strings attached. This model is put forth as being value neutral, as it does not require governments to adopt to democratic principles or uphold basic human rights. If China can implement this model, as it has been doing, it's going to be a two-track process, which has both short-term and long-term objectives. In the short term, China will work within the boundaries or the aegis of the present international trade regime. It's going to pretend to support established norms. It's going to continue to operate within this system so that it can accomplish its own foreign policy objectives, which are dependent on maintaining economic development and trade. Since the economic reforms of 1978, reforms and opening of Deng Xiaoping, China accepted many of these norms and rules of the liberal world order. Primary example is joining the World Trade Organization, and over time, it actually showed that it is more involved in key international organizations such as the United Nations. So, this initial embrace of multilateralism, it was a combination of choice and necessity because China needed economic development. And back then in 1978, it did not have the economic prowess to challenge the established liberal world order. So it started operating within it and utilizing it for its own economic development. China's entire political power, as it is in today's world, is built on its economic prowess. So it talked more about global integration, expanding its influence, developing soft power, and so on. Even at the moment, Beijing is unable to overturn completely all the rules which have been put in place by the Washington Consensus, by the US, by the liberal world order. It still doesn't have the capacity or the incentive to transform the entire existing world order. Therefore, in the short term or the near term, China will continue to work within these Western led multilateral institutions. It's going to tout its support for the established order, and it's going to maintain the system that has made it possible for its economic growth. It's going to minimize resistance to its actions until its replacement is fully functioning. By not directly challenging this established economic order, China can sustain its so called peaceful rise and attract the support of many Western academics, policymakers, who all believe that China will not replace the world system, and because the world system is responsible for its success. But that is just a facade. China will embrace multilateralism. It's going to become more involved in international institutions like the WTO and so on. But while it is accomplishing all these goals, it's also going to simultaneously develop Chinese led economic institutions. And we already see examples of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Development Bank, which Chinese political elite argue that these all uphold and deepen values and principles. In the long term, when the PRC's centenary is closer, as it gets more powerful and the power differential between the US and China decreases, China is going to push for reforms. It'll promote hypercapitalism. It'll minimize liberal democratic principles in Western led institutions. And as more and more countries join Chinese led institutions, Beijing will be able to use its economic power as a leverage to persuade, through a combination of sticks and carrots, of course, Western and non Western governments to support and adopt these reforms. I'll just give a very quick example. In South Asia, sorry, or within Asia, we understand the concept of debt trap diplomacy. But this concept is also disputed by several quarters of the world, and several quarters of the world being a part of the Western led liberal institutional order. If China can replicate this model over time, it is going to normalize the fact that if a country or an organization cannot repay the debt, then territory needs to be bartered off. It's going to do this normalization process. Now, while it's talking about trade, investments, all of these are things which the Western-led, Washington Consensus has taught us about. It's operating within this, but it's also pushing its own modus operandi. So the process has already started. So, Beijing will mute threat perception. It'll establish a network of economic relations, which it can and is using as a leverage. And by 2049, Western led institutions will remain, but their liberal principles will be diluted by reforms required by Beijing. As its economic power increases, more countries in both the global north and the global south will become dependent on Chinese trade and investment. Beijing is going to use its economic statecraft. It'll pressure countries to downplay or to abandon their democratic values and policies. Just to give an example again, or something that is actually based in reality, how many countries do we really have which have a trade surplus with China? You can count them on fingers. Taiwan, which anyways China claims as its own, Australia, Brazil, Switzerland, Oman, Chile, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Russia, and Qatar. So these are a total of 9 countries. If we were to believe Taiwan is a part of China, these become 8. Now, 190 plus countries in the world, and out of which there are just 8 with a trade surplus. So Chinese model will be to get more and more economic power and to increase more reliance. Once countries are more reliant on China, then China can go ahead and forge its own rules and principles and its own international order. Let's come to the political domain. China wants the triumph of authoritarianism in international politics. As I stated, historically, China's view of international relations is based on hierarchy and status. This perception remains till date. Chinese paternalism shapes Beijing's relations with countries which are seen as inferior. We can see it in China's high handedness in the South China Sea, or its practices in Africa, in Latin America, its trade disputes within Asia, and so on. This behavior suggests that China sees itself as the hegemon of Asia, and because of this, it is hypersensitive to foreign influence in the region. It responds very aggressively to territorial disputes, and its imperial ideology can be seen in statements made by President Xi Jinping on the Chinese dream, his emphasis on the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He constantly uses the term nation, whereas the concept of nation is very different from the concept of a country. Nation is more mired in the popular imagination. Countries have sovereign borders. When Xi Jinping is talking about a nation, he is evoking China's past, of this, whatever China was in this so called 5,000 years of history. So he uses the term nation, which means that there's a very clear cut approach to go back to whatever China was seen as by the Chinese and by the Chinese emperors back in the day. He also talks about developing socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is different from the Washington Consensus. So, after Xi Jinping consolidated his power within the CCP after the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, along with the comparison of Xi Jinping thought with, excuse me, with Deng Xiaoping's and Mao Zedong's thought among Chinese intellectuals and party officials, many China watchers have actually been concerned that Xi is becoming too powerful. He's already become too powerful. This theme of national rejuvenation has been used in one way or another by Chinese leaders since Sun Yat sen. But Xi Jinping is the first to export this China dream narrative to a global level. On the whole, a common view in China is that this rejuvenation is simply recapturing China's lost international status and power. It's not new, but for China, it's just a return to the proper order of international politics. Um, how does China push out this worldview? It contrasts itself to the principles or the free market or democratic principles of the Washington Consensus. And it goes ahead and promotes Beijing's political model and offers it to the developing world, a very regime type neutral investment which talks about non interference in domestic affairs, the promise of no strings attached, and so on. This business model is actually a part of China's charm offensive, and it's growing in popularity as many see around the world. Many countries across the world think that it's better to do business with the Chinese. It's a better alternative to the structural adjustment programs of the world, of the IMF, or the democratic reforms which are often associated with Western aid. But again, this is just a facade because it's not really no strings attached. One has to toe the Chinese political line. But then again, the counter narrative to China's charm offensive hasn't really been built. Um, let's think about 2049. China will be ideationally confident and will be exerting dominance more effectively in the economic, political, and military realms. It in 2049 will not need to integrate or negotiate with this existing economic system. It will expect others to accept the China order. We are already witnessing the early stages of international politics under Chinese dominance, be it its military bases, or the ADIZs in the ADIZs in the South China Sea. These are all violations of international law. When Philippines went to the Hague Tribunal and the tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines, China questioned, why does the Hague Tribunal even exist? So this is a clear-cut example of the first stages of this entire plan which China has for the world. Um, is there any evidence to any of this? So there are these findings from the second iteration of the Chinese Citizens Global Perception Survey, and the CGPS, or the Chinese Citizens Global Perception Survey, was done online and was done telephonically. It's a national survey conducted by the University of Alberta in cooperation with a survey firm in mainland China. It was done in the first quarter of 2024. It provides a demographically representative and statistically valid, very candid account of how the Chinese general public view other countries and their relationships with China. So this CCGPS 2024 examined mainland Chinese citizens' perspectives on China's current relations with global actors, including Australia, Canada, the EU, France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, the UK, and the US. If we look at this survey and the general global perception, Chinese citizens perceive China as the most influential global actor, followed closely by the US, Russia, and the EU. Japan, India, and Australia were regarded as being the least influential. Russia is considered to be the most trusted and important country to China's long term future. Japan and the US were perceived to be the least trustworthy. And you see, all of these are actually themes which you will find in China's imperial history as well. Japan and US are the least trustworthy. The very great amicable relations which China had with the then USSR and so on. Respondents of this survey perceived the US as the actor most likely to engage in military conflict with China. But this perception doesn't extend to US allied countries such as Australia, Canada, and the UK. Russia is seen as the least likely nation to engage in future military conflict with China. In terms of China's global roles, again, Chinese citizens want the PRC to take a more active international engagement role. This is a consistent trend across socio-economic lines, across different classes. The most favorable areas for Chinese global leadership are seen as peace and security, followed by technology and innovation. If you look at all the statements made by Xi Jinping in 2024, he's constantly harping on technology and innovation. So there is clearly a pattern. Now, the Chinese public does not favor decoupling, um, or decoupling of either economic ties or technological ties with the West, but they also don't support for expanding technological and economic ties. So again, as per the ideology which China has had, imperial China has had in the past, wherein it leverages the existing world order to its own advantage, its citizens also want that there should not be any decoupling by the West, but it would not want itself to do something further to expand technological and economic ties. So again, it's in line with this whole imperial ideology. There's a strong and widespread consensus regarding the importance of expanding economic and technological ties with Russia. Strangely enough, I found something that the least trustworthy country um, among all of these indices was Japan, closely followed by India. Even though they think that countries like India, Australia, and the UK cannot have too much of influence in the world, they still think that India is least trustworthy. Again, this also has historical biases. So in a small nutshell, this is what China sees the world as. This is largely a continuation of what they've had, their hierarchical Confucius world order, their whole concept of Tianxia, all under the heaven, the rule of the emperor, and so on. And it's not really changed much. It's just that in the current epoch of history, these correlations are not being made as much as they should be. So, with this, I'll stop, and thank you so much for so patiently listening to me.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sriparna Pathak, for a very lucid explanation of China's worldview. Before we go on to the questions that are in the chat room, I'll probably make a couple of observations and might ask you a couple of questions. I think it's very important for our viewers to understand that whether it was Imperial China till 1911, ruled by a dynasty, or Republic of China from 1911 to 1949, ruled by Kuomintang, or prior to Kuomintang, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, or Chiang Kai-shek, followed by communist takeover. China's core philosophy has not changed. Despite being ruled by an egalitarian communist party, China continues its imperialist DNA. And I think that is really not understood so much in the West. Hence, the detente with China post 1971 and the delusion that bringing China into market economy will change Chinese behavior or make them accept the liberal order, or for that matter, that diplomacy is actually not real. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. That misunderstanding is exacerbated by Chinese policy of deception, using deception and not having transparency. So our viewers need to understand that there's a continuity in China's policy of expansionism and hegemonic dominance, not just in its near abroad or in its periphery, but over the entire world. That has been the worldwide view from historical times. So that's a kind of observation I'll make, and I will start taking questions from the audience, and there are quite a few questions. So the first question is from Kalpit Manikar. Question is, India and China are both civilizational states. How does China perceive India as a civilizational state? And importantly, India's rise given its hierarchical Yanexia mindset. And you have already touched upon it, but I think this would be a time to elaborate on this much more.
Sure. Thank you so much for wonderfully capturing the gist, and also thank you, Kalpit, for that excellent question. China talks about its 5,000 years of history, and it bases it on oracle bones and so on. How does China really see India? China says that India doesn't have a written account of its history. So, which means that its history is not as long as China's. So, roughly, it would be in Chinese, as per Chinese lenses, Indian history would not be more than 3,000 years old. So, that's how it sees Indian history. It doesn't even want India to be called as big a civilizational state as China is, which is why constantly there's this rhetoric that India doesn't have a written account. Neither does China. Oracle bones are not proof enough of history. But China touts this whole thing about 5,000 years of history because then it also can show that it's a civilizational big brother or big sister, whichever way it might really be seen. Does that really mean that China completely disregards India's history? It understands that India is also a civilizational state, which is why it puts in so much of efforts into constantly saying that India does not have written history and so on. It's just that China or contemporary China has a brilliant propensity to cut and paste history as it wants, whereas India has not done that. Maybe it's against our civilizational ethos or our strategic culture, but China really does that. Um, China actually somehow resents India's existence of this civilizational history, which is why it resorts to this. Another thing which comes in here is this whole concept of Buddhist ties. Whenever there's any sort of conflict between India and China, China will try to take India back to Buddhist ties. But then, if India doesn't even have that longer history, where did Buddhist ties really come in from? So, this is a contradiction, of course, which needs to be pointed out to China. It says that yes, India is the Buddhism came, it says in these clear terms when you translate into English from Chinese, that Buddhism came to China from India. But of late it has also started putting out this narrative that the Buddha was born in Nepal. Fair enough, Siddharth was born in Nepal, what is now Nepal, but he became the Buddha in India, not in Nepal, right? So it would want to take away even that bit of civilizational history from India. It has promoted Chinese Buddhism. What exactly is Chinese Buddhism? You know, China's own brand of Buddhism, as simple as that. So, if it is not, it doesn't, if it goes unchecked, maybe in the near future, I know I'm sounding very fear mongering sorts of, but there could be a possibility that if China is not checked, it'll be the only civilizational country in the world, because it does look down upon the existence of India's civilizational history. So, which is why I think yesterday also it said that, in Zhejiang province, China has started using technology to showcase Chinese Buddhism. What is Chinese Buddhism? Just an attempt to take away from what actually Buddhism is. We don't talk about it as Indian Buddhism. We say Buddhism is Buddhism, but there's an attempt to even rewrite that. I hope I've answered your question. Thanks again, Kalpit.
I think the question has been very ably answered. Just to add to it, China is trying to use Buddhist diplomacy by organizing actually conferences of Buddhist nations in China. Also, China's claim to be the sole determining authority on reincarnation of the Dalai Lama tells you that although officially they are atheist, godless communists, but they are going to use Buddhist diplomacy to their advantage in any sphere and every sphere. So let's be cognizant of that. Next question is from Dr. Vineet Singh. And the question is, do you feel that eventually the massive ever-growing middle and upper middle class of China, which is exposed to democracy and free speech of the West, will lead to inside dissent, a call for reforms in CPC, or maybe repeat of Tiananmen Square type of protests?
One thing about China is that it keeps whatever it learns from history in its mind. It's not just Tiananmen Square, but earlier in the epoch of history, and I'm not going to go too much into ancient history, there was a particular point in time where a particular commoner decided to convert into Christianity and said that he's the king and he's going to reform imperial China. That wasn't really taken well by the monarchs, by the emperors. So they've learned, they are very cautious about foreign influences, which is why you see all sorts of crackdowns or all sorts of surveillance mechanisms still present in China. This is the 21st century. We are sitting in 2024. Social media is connecting people all across the globe. We talk about globalization, but I think social media is one thing which really connects people, but that is not still available in China. Would the people really take to the streets as Tiananmen happened? See, the reason as to why Tiananmen happened needs to be understood here. It was the simple thing of, it was started by students, and students basically wanted the small, small freedoms which people generally should have. Things like being able to keep the lights switched on in dormitories beyond, say, 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. or whatever that the central government decides, or being able to partake in the new benefits which were supposed to come out after Tang Xiaoping's economic reforms, but those were not really coming up. Those were still going to children of party members. So there was a frustration, there was an angst. So it started with the mobilization of the youth, and which later on, went into other segments of the society, laborers, and so on. They also chose that particular timing because Gorbachev was supposed to visit Tiananmen at that time, and the international media would be watching. So the students thought that this could be a good enough pressure tactic to at least persuade the government to come and talk. It wasn't expected that China will not care about the presence of the international media and it's just going to run tanks over. Um, Tiananmen is not even talked about today. You know, the words would be wiped off social media. You can't really do searches and so on. China does not want a repeat of that, which is why it has been very carefully guarding it. Does this mean people don't protest in China? They do. When it comes to do or die, they do. And one recent example of this was the white paper protest, which led to the loosening of the extremely draconian 3 year old COVID 19 policies. What happened? It started in Xinjiang. And basically, because there were roadblocks every single where, when there was a fire, the ambulance or the fire brigade could not reach in time. That led to the deaths, particularly of a lot of children. Now, because of decades of one China policy, people
One child
ended up
policy.
losing their only child.
One child
So,
policy.
and that,
One China
yeah.
policy.
So, when people lost their only child because of that fire, because of the mismanagement, because of the COVID 19 lockdowns, people from across the country felt that it could happen to them. They also had, most of them have just one child. And if, God forbid, there's a fire in their apartments and the fire brigade never reaches because there are so many strict controls, it could happen. So people took to the streets with just a blank paper, which essentially meant that I have nothing to say to you. You are so cruel, I have nothing to say to you, but I come out and protest. Basically, it meant that, with that whole white paper protest, and that was a big gathering. After that, the government relaxed slowly and steadily all the COVID 19 policies, the lockdowns which it had in place. People do protest. When it's do or die, they do protest. But then again, the surveillance is extremely high. It's going to take a bit of time for that surveillance or people to understand how to go about this sort of surveillance. Within China, you will see cameras at every 100 to 200 meters on the road. They say it's for crime control. There's facial recognition every single where. You have something called the huko system, to which your identity is tied, and so on. Everything, every data of yours is monitored. Even things, if you book, say, on car hailing apps, you book stuff, even that data is tracked. So it's very difficult to mobilize in that sort of a way. From democracies, it's difficult to understand how does this really happen. But if ever one has the fortune or misfortune, whichever way you see it, to live in China, one understands it's very difficult to mobilize that ways. You'll see police patrols at regular intervals on the road. So it's a bit difficult. Would there be a call for dissent? For small, small things, China does dissent. Chinese people do dissent. White paper protests, or corrupt, not just corruption also, but say pollution in particular, and so on. But those are very localized and small scale. A large scale protest wherein people say we need a change of the governance system, in my view, it's difficult to envisage. Say, these are people who, for decades, for forever since their birth, have been used to following a particular order. It is difficult for them to envisage history. Social media is pretty much blocked. Facebook doesn't work, LinkedIn will not work, Twitter will not work. So you would not even know what the true ideals of democracy is, how they work outside. And you are fixed in a particular way as to how you lead your life, how you take authority. It's very difficult to influence these people. Even when, say, students do go abroad, the Chinese government keeps a tab on them so that they don't get too much influenced by these ideals of democracy in Australia or in the US or in India. There will be letters from the embassy and so on, so that they can be kept in check and they don't get too influenced and don't take the ideas back to China. So it's a bit difficult to envisage that, a large scale protest demanding that CPC becomes something which is more democratic happens. That's the unfortunate truth.
I'll just add a bit for our viewers. Not only Chinese government and CPC maintain a tab on students, there are Chinese overseas police stations which are used to send very strong messages to these students and basically used to intimidate them and terrorize them that their family members would be at risk. And it's not only the students, but also diaspora that is affected by these overseas Chinese police stations. So just be aware of that. I'll go on to the next question, and then that is from Major General Amarjit Singh. And it's a good question. The articulation till now is broadly straight in the narrative about China's future. What are the uncertainties that may result in clearly different geopolitical outcomes in a time frame of 2030 and beyond? For example, the factors like CPAC turned out very different from what they were envisaged, when they were started. So do you think there's a straight line to 2049 as China conceptualizes, or the conglomeration of factors will influence Chinese dream?
Thank you again for the question. See, if we don't think of what the future will look like under the Chinese leadership of the world, and it's a very scary proposition, most probably we will not make tweaks, as the world has not really been making the tweaks. What are the current challenges which China is facing? The economy has clearly tanked. They say they are maintaining 4% growth, but Chinese statistics are also just a big bag of bluff. But any independent analyst, say Rhodium Group, etc., puts the growth rates at nothing more than 1.5%. So the economy is a huge problem. The real estate has crashed. Banking sector has crashed. Domestic consumption historically has been low, continues to be low. Youth unemployment is so high that China said that it will not publish statistics on youth unemployment. So it's a very bad mix of situations. But that being said, over the years, China has accumulated a lot of forex reserves, which keeps it afloat, which is why you will still see China flexing its muscles elsewhere. Technically, it should not be flexing its muscles in the South China Sea if it does not really have the money, but it still does. Technically, it should not really be talking about It still talks about the BRI. Where is it getting the money for the BRI, right? You mentioned CPEC. Yes, you're right. Even in the CPEC, that bit of investments hasn't really come in. But be it CPEC, which is an important part of the BRI, um, money has not really been flowing. It's not an economic venture, it's more of a strategic venture. Why would China, which is a very rational, smart actor, it thinks for itself, its own national interest first, which doesn't augur very well for the rest of the world, but yeah, it's a rational actor. Why would it think of investing in the most bankrupt country of the world, Pakistan? What can it really get out of it? Well, it gets access to West Asia. It continues to needle India, of course, because it has to keep fronts open against India, which is why CPEC exists still on paper. And you can also keep placating the Pakistanis, saying that, look, you're going to get great benefits out of this. It's easy to fool or easy to create perceptions when the perception of that particular country is already biased against the common enemy, which in this case becomes India, right? So it's a very strategic initiative. Pakistan is not getting that bit of loans. In fact, China is actually charging it quite a lot, leading it further into bankruptcy, which of course doesn't augur very well for us, because the more bankrupt Pakistan is, the more it resorts to terrorism against us, of course. So that also works well for China. If Pakistan continues in its whole terrorist tirades against India, if it can needle India through Pakistan, sure, why not? It's a very strategic initiative. Has the BRI been written off? BRI has faltered even in Southeast Asia, which is why countries have renegotiated terms of the BRI. Italy has withdrawn from the BRI completely, and so on. The BRI is now being repackaged. The BRI, if you see, Xi Jinping is talking about the green BRI, or it is talking about tech, the usage of tech in BRI, or the usage of people to people. Why is it doing this? If China is investing a bit less, it can still talk about green BRI or tech, in which it does not need as much of investment as it would need to create those sorts of railroads, etc. So it's a good way. Second, it can say that, look, we talk about a sustainable future, green development, all of the things which matters to countries of the global south in particular. China will placate them through that. So I don't think we should write the BRI off yet. See, BRI is a pet project of Xi Jinping. In China, or in Chinese, there's a concept of losing face, which they would not tolerate at any cost. Xi Jinping, who wants to present a strong man, personality, definitely would not. It's been written into the constitution. It's not going to be removed. It's going to stay in place. They're just going to repackage it, remodel it, and resell it to countries in different formats, and look as and be viewed as the savior of the world. So even if things turn out differently, somehow China leverages even the bad aspects of it and packages it in such a way so that it looks good enough. What can we really do? The democratic world or the free world is not united, unfortunately, which is why China can continue to push out its charm offensives. There is no notes comparison, say, even between the ages of the Quad, as to how does China's weaponization of trade really work. How has it worked against Australia? How has it worked against Japan? What did Australia do to safeguard itself? Australia has done quite a lot in the last 5 years, since that Wuhan virus spread the whole havoc across the world. Japan also has been suffering quite a lot of it. Do we compare notes? In different facets, to a much limited extent, it has happened against India as well. Our marine exports have constantly been blocked for whatever bizarre reasons which China gives. We don't compare notes. Even when we are friends within the Quad, it's not and we say it's not even a military organization. Fair enough, it's not a military organization, but let's start talking about these things which matter. Trade matters to the world right now. We don't do that. Unfortunately, there's a lack of a coherent approach towards China. If we could have that, then yes, maybe we could also do similar things, just to protect ourselves from these very imperialistic ambitions which China has. Thank you.
Let me bring to another aspect in continuation of Major General Amarjit Singh's question. You did talk about economy and real estate sectors being down. How do you envisage impact of demographic changes in China vis-a-vis Chinese dream of 2049, specifically addressing the 421 problem?
Again, demographic changes, I think I forgot mentioning it, is another ticking bomb for China. Not even a ticking bomb, but maybe a bomb which has already exploded, because their total fertility rate is also very, very low. And that means that there's an aging population for which the state must put in more investments for medication, for old age care, and so on, which means a further drain on their own resources. Secondly, for the future, if there is no positive demographics, then who takes all these designs and desires forward? Because you'll need to have a working age population, which is why of late Xi Jinping has been coming up with different sorts of formulations telling women to produce children. The one child policy has been relaxed precisely because of this. At one point, Mao Zedong put it in place because there was a lot of urbanization happening, because people, to escape that great leap forward, thought it's better to escape to urban arenas just to curtail that. Huko was set in place, one child policy was set in place, and all of that. But that had a terrible impact in the long run. And now, working age population is shrinking very rapidly. Again, there's an India angle to this as well. So when India talks about positive demographics, China does get worried. Why and how? Because China says Indian demographics is not of quality, as if China would know what is of quality and is not of quality. But they do say that. Why do they have to say that? Because demographics plays a very key role in taking the future of any country forward. China doesn't have that. India currently has that, which is why it questions the quality of the Indian youth, or the labor force, and so on. So demographics is a ticking bomb. Xi Jinping has started his whole propaganda again about how women need to take the lead in producing more babies, and as to how they'll be doing a great favor to the nation. That is their duty, that is their responsibility. How far will this propaganda work is something which we need to see, because even the Chinese youth are not even getting married, because they have something called the bride price, which is humongous. Even to get married, the man has to pay a lot of money, have a lot of possessions in terms of cars and bank balance and so on. So they are even refusing to get married. And as more women are getting educated, even in China, they'd rather, because they also don't have a lot of things in place which would facilitate a work life balance for women, which is why they don't have fully paid 6 months of maternity leave and so on. So, which is why this whole question of what's going to take China forward, who is going to take China forward, is a very big question mark. Which is why Xi Jinping is starting with his formulations. Will this really work? I think maybe we need to wait for 5 years and see if there are more children who are being produced. And then maybe we can predict if all of these imperialist designs can be taken forward.
Next question is from Dr. Shrikant Chopra. And the question is, does CPC care about public opinion? If it does, what are the mechanisms and parameters of these assessments, and how are these incorporated in administrative policy of the government?
Hmm. It cares about the public opinion in the sense that it wants to keep a tab of what the public is thinking and if they will mobilize or not. For example, when there are these global trends, once upon a time there was Me Too, and the hashtag Me Too was banned in China. This was because Chang Kaoli had harassed the Olympics player, and she had charged, and well, she has disappeared now. Anyway, so Me Too was a big movement even in China. Their censors were constantly removing these sorts of hashtags. They care, which is why they are constantly surveilling. China actually puts in more of its budget in internal stability than external stability, because it has to stay as a cohesive country, which is why it cares. Well, you can't say, it cares, but it rather keeps an eye on public opinion. Are they really discussing what exactly are they? Anything which is even seen as offensive, not even to the party or to the country, but might just be just a critique of, say, oh, the society in today's world is hyper commercialized, is hyper capitalist, even that would be taken down. So, and that's public opinion. The public is thinking about that. Or if it would, start talking about, oh, the cow or the examination system, which ensures that people, children basically, 18-year-olds, do or do not get entry into public universities. That's very difficult. That needs to be changed. Well, there's a possibility that people might mobilize around it. So it keeps a tab on public opinion. Does it really care enough? Well, yes, if it becomes, it has the potentials to become as problematic as the white paper movement, then yes, it cares in the sense that it cares for its own stability. The party cares for its own stability, which is why it keeps an eye on public opinion. What are the mechanisms and parameters of these assessments? Look, there's constant surveillance. People would be constantly they are paid money to just sit and monitor social media. That's the basic method of assessment. How are these incorporated in administrative policies? A, constantly blocking out sensitive comments or sensitive discussions. Or if it gets too much, Xi Jinping or one of the Politburo members would come up with one of these statements about how, a very vague statement though, about how it is important to be nationalistic, how you need to care about the country, and so on, and very tacitly put out the fact that you're not supposed to discuss this or mobilize against this because your duty is to the motherland. So that's how it happens. I hope I could answer your question.
Now, in the same vein, from this question and from a previous question, Xi Jinping has basically neutralized internal opposition within the CPC. Do you think that the Shanghai clique, the Communist Youth League, and the princelings have been totally emasculated, or there are remnants that could resurrect themselves and challenge Xi Jinping's, authority in near future?
So could you just repeat? I lost you for a bit. Could you
Okay.
just ask the question again? There was some technological error.
Xi Jinping had effectively neutralized internal dissent in the CPC. Do you think that the
Hmm.
Shanghai clique, the Communist Youth League, and the princelings faction, they have been totally emasculated by Xi Jinping, or they are remnants of internal opposition in these suppressed factions of CPC?
Again, very interesting question. During, just when this pandemic had started, there was a lot of questioning on, say, just, their own WeChat. And the princelings in particular were very critical of Xi Jinping and his increasing grasp. A lot of them were put under house arrest. So even WeChat messages somehow were being read by, people. But yes, there was a dissent in those, in especially 2019 and 2020. There was a lot of critique of Xi Jinping or his policies. There was even an article by a very big businessman who called Xi Jinping as the emperor without the clothes, and he was immediately arrested, imprisoned, and so on. There was dissent. Even the Communist Party Youth League, a few names were popping up. Who could be the possible replacement to Xi Jinping in the near future? In today's 2024, you will not see any of those discussions anymore. He has effectively wiped out all of those. He would not want any sort of opposition to him. If you look at his anti corruption policies of tiger and flies, catching the tigers and the flies, who are these people who are getting slapped with corruption charges? In some way or the other, they would have, even if it's in a very minor way, would have defied or have put Xi Jinping off in certain ways. 11 PLA rocket force members are missing, defense minister is missing, and so on. So it's an increasing autocratic mechanism, and just to show that he is doing something, and these people have done something wrong. These cases of anti-corruption are being slapped on them left, right, and center. Shanghai clique, princelings, you will not hear any sort of discussions from them. In fact, at the 20th Party Congress, his power is so much that he got Hu Jintao escorted out. It was Hu Jintao, because of whom Xi Jinping, you know, basically got the chair that he has. But then, in a very disrespectful way, Hu Jintao was escorted out. The reasons given were that, oh, he had some health issues and so on. But the body language which Hu Jintao displayed and the look on his face was clearly not that of someone who was ill or who was suffering. So that is the amount of grasp he has. He has essentially eradicated any sort of opposition from within the Politburo or within, different sorts of factions.
Despite sending that message, there were some reports from last year that in that Bidahe resort meeting, elders in the Chinese Communist Party took Xi Jinping to task. Is there any substance to that, or?
Again, Li Keqiang this year, again, January, unfortunately passed away. There have been a bit of questioning, even again around that, because Li Keqiang's ways and mechanisms were a bit different from Xi Jinping's. Because even before the 20th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping was going and laying wreaths, on the remnants of, or on the graves of, say, people who fought the civil war and so on, showing a very militaristic approach, Li Keqiang visited the statue of Deng Xiaoping, showing that it should be more of economics in command. So, Chinese people, maybe it's a part of their culture. When they have to show dissent also, they are not verbal and vocal in the ways in which democracies teach us. They will do their things tacitly. So Li Keqiang also did that, saying that, the economy is cracking, his economy is crashing down. All these tirades against Alibaba, Tencent, and so on, companies which have taken China's economic growth rates forward. These are things which could not be done. So that was his very tacit way of saying it. There is dissent, but people are disappearing. The moment they show any sort of dissent, or they are dying mysteriously. So that's if from a democratic lens, it would seem very bizarre, but this is a communist China. So, and it's a very autocratic leader who wants full grasps over power.
Well, we don't have any more questions in the chat room. So if you want to make any last minute comment, Dr. Sriparna, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And maybe one last thing which I would want to say is that China has a long-term plan. It has a long-term strategy. It wants to be the preeminent Middle Kingdom, and it uses a lot of different sorts of mechanisms to attain this, to achieve this. What can the world really do? We all democracies, all of our democracies have different views towards stability, peace, world order, etc. But an autocratic ruler of the international system doesn't augur very well for any of us. Not for the US, not for Australia, not for UK, not for India. We are all, but not for Japan, not for Australia, not for New Zealand, and so on. So there needs to be at least some sort of coming together to put our heads together, stop squabbling amongst ourselves so much. We are democracies, there will always be problems. That's how democracies are built. Maybe if we stop attacking each other so that, China doesn't have the last laugh, then maybe we can have a better approach to 2049. Otherwise, it's going to be a very precarious situation. So I'd just like to end with that.
I'll just make one last minute editorial comment. In today's discussion, we have not talked about internal religious reform movements uh, and their impact on China's dream of 2049. A number of CPC members are quitting the membership of the party because of the Qigong movement. And I think at this point in time, there are probably 50 million people who are openly allied to Qigong movement. What impact that would have on 2049 when people have started to renounce CPC, whereas that used to be the stepping stone to success.
Let's hope more and more people understand and can do that, not for the world's sake, but for their own sakes. Let's hope that happens, because let's hope everyone has the rights and freedoms which every free person should have?
Well, our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Sriparna Pathak for giving such a educative, informative lecture on China's worldview and its road to 2049. Really very thankful to you, Dr. Pathak. I hope you'll continue to come on our platform and educate our viewers. My thanks to the audience members also on a Saturday morning here in US and evening in India. They are able to find some time for very dry subject that does not affect common man's day-to-day life. My thanks to Team CSA, specifically Mr. Ripudaman Pachori and Mr. Rajiv Verma, who helped me, arrange these kind of programs. Without their support from behind, these kind of educational programs are not possible. So thank you everyone for joining this program. A video recording of this program will be available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. And once again, we are grateful to Dr. Pathak for coming on this platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.